Hey, good morning, y'all. Thank you for tapping in for some real talk from the heart this morning. We're reading through the Bible twice per year, 7 chapters per day. It's about an hour of reading. And this morning's real talk comes from 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 19 through 24. And in this section, the Apostle Paul, in his letter to the Corinthians, is basically saying, hey, live as you were called. Right? Live as you were called. Remain in the calling in which God called you. He's been talking about marriage, been talking about free or slave, and then he gets to the issue of, circumcised or not. And so let me read this verse, and I want to get into our real talk. It says, circumcision is nothing, and uncircumcision is nothing, but keeping the commandments of God is what matters. We are not right with God because we keep the law. We're not right with God because we keep certain rules or certain traditions, certain ceremonies. None of that makes us right with God. We are made right with God by the atoning blood of the Lord Jesus Christ. Going back to Leviticus 17, Leviticus 17 talks about how God would atone for sin. And he talks about that blood, right, is the life of the body. It's the life of the flesh. And it would be the blood that would be given to provide atonement for sin. And so that's the premise. That's the premise. Now, because we are saved by grace through faith, not of works, doesn't mean that obedience no longer matters to God. Sometimes people will kind of take that mindset that, well, I'm saved by grace through faith and not of works, so I don't really have to obey God. But beloved, can I tell you this, man? Obedience still matters to God. Right? You've heard before, right? Grace is not a license to sin. Right? Grace is really an empowerment to live the life. I mean, grace is what we're saved by, no doubt, but grace also enables us. It empowers us to live a life that pleases God. And a life that pleases God is a life that obeys God. And so we see that very clearly throughout the Bible. There are people who set their hearts and minds to where you know what, I'm not going to obey his voice. I'm not going to obey his word. And you know what? Some people go so far as to not even want to hear. They don't even want to hear God. They don't want to hear his word. They don't want to have anything to do with God whatsoever. They've made up their mind. They've made up their heart that they are not going to obey him. And you guys, that is a dangerous ground to be walking on. I mean, I'm sure maybe you've met people like that. I know I have met people like that. They get really angered when you bring up the things of God. And if they're not angry about the things of God, they mock it. And so it's usually one or the other, right? They're usually upset and mad that you brought up God, or they're just going to make fun of it and, and mock it and poke fun. That's usually the one of the two. But here he says in this text, right, when you read again down through verse 24, one of the things that Paul says is that you were bought at a price. Do not become slaves of men. That's verse 23. You were bought at a price. Do not become slaves of men. He said back in chapter 6, he says, you are not your own, for you were bought at a price. That's 1 Corinthians 6, 19 and 20. Now, there is a way that we can become slaves of men if we're not careful. And the way we can become slaves of men is by living for their approval. Living for man's approval is a way to become a slave of sin. Trying to fit in with them. Trying to fit in with them, man. Trying to dress like them, talk like them, walk like them, trying to do their lifestyle. Man, you can become a slave of men that way. You can become a slave of men by caring what they think about you. People are enslaved by the opinions of men because they're trying to please them. And listen, and like what we're talking about today, we're talking about obedience. Man, you could become a slave of man and trying to obey their philosophies, their ideologies, right, their way of thinking. In a very real sense, you can become a slave of men. Paul says here, right, listen, you were bought at a price, and that price is the blood of Christ. Don't become a slave of men, right? You need to be Christ's slave. And he actually says that a little bit further on down. But when you get to verse 24, man, I love it because he says, remain in God. In the calling that you had Remain in God. Those words right there in verse 24, 1 Corinthians 7:24. Man, remain in God. That's the big deal. That's the big deal, man. As he says here, right? It's not circumcision or uncircumcision. He says what matters is obeying God. And how do you do that? Listen, you remain in God, and you remain in God if you are obeying God. If you are obeying God, you're remaining in God. You see how that works together? And so Jude 21 says this: keep yourself in the love of God. It doesn't say keep yourself in a place where God will love you. It says you keep yourself in love with God. How do you do that? Well, Jesus tells us in the Gospel of John on a couple of different passages. He says, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. That's actually John, the Gospel of John, chapter 14, verse 15. And then when you get on down a little bit further in John 14, verse 21, man, Jesus really expounds on this, and he tells us what it means and what it brings. Watch this. This is John chapter 14, verse 21. He says, he who has my commandments and keeps them, it is he who loves me. And he loves me and will be loved by my Father, and I will love him. And then Jesus says this, and I will manifest myself to him. I will reveal myself to him. I will make myself known to him. To who? To the one who is obedient. To the one who obeys me, Jesus says. And so, man, that's very clear. Does obedience still matter to the Lord? You bet it does. Are we saved by obedience? No. But because we're saved, we should obey. That's how that works, right? And so obedience still matters to God. We should be living our lives every day to obey, right? There's an old song we used to sing, trust and obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus but to trust and obey. Sometimes that happiness is not there. Why? Because we're living in disobedience. Sometimes that happiness is not there. Why? Because we're not trusting him. Live every day to obey, man, and you're going to have a very fulfilling life, a very enriched life. But obedience still matters to God. The Lord loves you. I love you too. Praying for you today. Please be praying for me, man. I hope you have a great Wednesday. Hey, listen, if you're in the area, tonight I'll be teaching Proverbs 29 as we go verse by verse through the Old Testament on Wednesday nights. Calvary Chapel, Toppenish, 408 West 6th Avenue, 7 o'clock tonight. Proverbs 29. I hope you'll be there. And if you don't live in the area, please tap in. We'll be live on Facebook. All right, man. Salute. The Lord loves you. Have a good one.